Hello everybody and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. Today we're tackling the Imperial Crosshair helmet. I know, I do it Imperial Crosshair before I do the actual Crosshair, but we'll get there, I promise. This helmet was a lot of fun to make and I really love how it turns out. I used a lot of the same painting techniques as I did with Echo, and I loved how Echo turned out, so I love this helmet as well. Now this helmet was 3D printed and you can find links for the 3D prints or the 3D files in the description. But we're going to start assuming that you already have a 3D printed helmet. With all that said, let's get right into it. Now the first thing I like to do when we're smoothing out the helmet is use an SLA printer resin. In this case, I have some ABS-like photopolymer resin in a clear blue color. Now the color doesn't really matter, I just wasn't planning on printing anything with this clear blue, so I thought I'd use it for this helmet. Now along with the resin, you're going to need some source of ultraviolet light. With me here, I have a UV flashlight that's going to work great. It's going to produce those UV light rays that will harden this resin. Now you could also just let it sit out in the sun for a while, but I like to brush on a little bit of the resin and then switch to the flashlight, and I'll explain why. Now this resin is like a pure liquid. It's a little bit thicker than water, but when you're brushing it on the helmet, it's going to want to run and like pool in some deep corners and all that, and we don't want that, because once we've cured that resin, it's going to be a lot harder to get out of those corners and sand those out. So what I'm doing here is I've got a cheap chip brush that I'm not worried about. I'm going to brush on the resin in some small areas, like starting with the dome and then moving on to the face. And then after I've completed a little section, I'll use that UV flashlight just for around 10 seconds to start hardening the UV resin on the helmet. That is, of course, once I've checked that all the resin is like smooth and not pooling in any area or running off the helmet somewhere. And since we're doing it in small sections, it's easier to keep track of that. I find this method preferable to Bondo because Bondo is kind of easy to sand away and accidentally sand away too much. You'd have to really be sanding really hard to sand through all this resin once it's cured, because it is pretty hard stuff. It's a lot quicker and simpler to apply. Well, maybe not simpler, but cleaner. And Bondo leaves a really bad smell in your garage or wherever you're putting it. You can go over as many coats with this resin as you like. I'll probably go over 1 or 2 more coats on the dome area where those layer lines are very tall and visible. And this stuff is also a lot easier to get into the hard corners and like the deep edges of the helmet compared to Bondo. And it's a lot, and it's not more expensive at all. This bottle that I am using costs around $30, but I could do probably half a dozen helmets with this single bottle, whereas it usually takes me around a tube and a half of the Bondo stuff. So like I said, I'll probably go over 1 or 2 more coats with the resin, using the UV flashlight to harden that resin before I move on. Okay guys, now that the resin is all hardened and we've got as many layers as we want, we're gonna start sanding. Now to save a lot of time and energy, I'm going to be using this mouse sander with I think it's a 120 grit pad on it. And we're going to use it to get a lot of the large open areas to just save us some time, really, because sanding is the worst part of this whole process. There's going to be a lot of it, so finding shortcuts is great. And like I said earlier, this resin stuff hardens pretty hard, so you do not want to sand all this by hand. It'll take a lot longer than you think. Just be sure not to sand all the way through the resin. If you start hitting plastic with this mouse sander, it's going to just start to shred it, heat it up, and make it look ugly. Like I said, we're just going to hit a lot of the large open areas to just save us some time. So don't feel like you have to get everything at this point. Okay, now it's time for good old Rust-Oleum filler and sandable. I'm going to use this stuff to help identify any print lines that we missed or areas that still need a little bit more work, a little bit more attention, and it's really going to do a good job at both filling in print lines and showing us what areas still need some work. So I'll just do 1 coat of this just to see those areas, and then we'll move on. So we're not totally done with Bondo forever. It is still one of the best materials at filling in printer lines, and we're going to use it to touch up all the areas of our helmet that the Rust-Oleum filler and sandable pointed out to us. And I'm going to be going over a majority of the helmet with this stuff, but having that base layer of resin is very nice at preventing us from sanding through the Bondo too far to where the print lines are visible again, and it also means we have to use less Bondo. Be sure and wear a glove and a respirator when working with this stuff, and set it aside in a well-ventilated area, someplace that you don't mind if it stinks for a while, because it's definitely going to. So I'll come back in around 24 hours, and this stuff should be fully cured. Okay, now that the Bondo is fully hardened, we're ready to do some hand sanding. I'm going to start with 180 grit sandpaper and just go to town around the entire helmet. Now when you're sanding this stuff, you absolutely need to wear a respirator, because as you can see from my white shorts, it is just getting red dust all over it, and you definitely don't want to be breathing that. That's also why I use a shop vac as I'm sanding to just try and suck up some of that dust before it gets in the air and on my clothes. This is the time though where we really start to smooth out the helmet, so alternate between the Bondo and the Rust-Oleum filler and sandable to get your surface smooth and ready for painting. You could take this as far or as short as you like, so long as you're happy with the finish of the helmet, that's all that matters. Here you can see me hit the helmet with the Rust-Oleum filler and sandable again. It really does a great job at filling in a lot of those very, very tiny scratches and overall give the helmet a much smoother look. For the last coat before painting, I've been using this product called Plasti Dip. It's basically a spray on rubber. I used it for both Wrecker and Echo, so I'm going to do it again with Imperial Crosshair. I feel like it gives the helmet a nice texture to it and a nice feeling. It also fills in some of the lines, and I don't know, I just like how the helmet feels in my hands after this stuff is dried. I'm going to be applying just around 1 or 2 coats of this Plasti Dip stuff. Like I said, it's a spray on rubber, so you don't want to go too heavy in a single area because it'll be really prone to overspray. But once this stuff is cured, we should be ready for painting finally. So for the base coat of Crosshair, I went with a Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte Slate. I thought it wasn't exactly fully black, but it was definitely a darker shade of gray. So this is going to be our base coat, so cover the entire helmet with this stuff. We'll add other colors as we move along. Okay, now Imperial Crosshair's helmet has a lot of little hard to see scratches on it, so painting this was going to be a challenge, but I think I found a way that works pretty well. My practice with the Echo helmet really helped a lot. So what I'm going to be doing is using some paper towels and some white spray paint. I'll spray a little bit of paint on the paper towels, let it air dry just a little bit, and then I'll use that paper towel to kind of draw the scuff marks around the helmet. Crosshair's new helmet kind of has these scratches all over the place, so just go overboard on this. Like, go around the entire helmet, just don't, paint the whole thing white. Now, shortly after the white, we're going to follow it up with our slate gray again. And we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to spray some of that slate on the paper towel and then rub that slate over the white. It's going to really dull the white a lot, make it harder to see and less visible, and really kind of blend it into the base color of the helmet. At the end, I felt like some of the whites were still a little bit too white, so what I did was I held the helmet really far away and just kind of did a light dusting of the slate to just kind of darken those whites a bit. Okay, now it's time to start adding some more details to the helmet. I'm going to start with the green respirators on the mouthpiece. Now I was planning to use this green window tint for the visor, since Crosshair has a green visor now, and I wanted it to match the aerators, so we're going to be using the same material to fill in those aerators. I'm just going to cut out the shape of a circle and the size of the aerator and glue it down. I'll see if I can find the link for this window tint and add it in the description, but any green tinted window tint should be fine. Moving on to the visor. Now I was originally planning on using a green shaded visor and then adding the green window tint to it, but one kind of canceled out the other. You couldn't really see the dark green if you laid the window tint on top, and if you laid the window tint on the bottom or on the inside, you couldn't see the green window tint anyway. So instead I'm going to be going with a clear visor and then putting the window tint on the inside. First though, I get a rough estimation of how big the visor needs to be, so I put a piece of paper on the inside and just kind of trace out a rough outline of the visor to give us a general shape of what I need to cut out. From that point, it's time to affix the visor on the inside of the helmet, and for this I like to use a steel stick epoxy putty. It's a 2-part putty that you just rub together, and after like a minute it'll start to harden and eventually will just be like hard as a rock. So it'll hold the visor in place very well. It binds to the inside of the helmet very well since the inside still has all those 3D printer lines. That's a lot of good texture for the putty to grip into and provide a strong hold. So for this helmet, I'm going to start with the putty in the middle, just kind of hold it down for the few minutes that it takes to harden, and then I'll cut up the remainder of the stick and put it in like the 4 corners and maybe a few other places just to provide enough hold to keep this visor in place. Oftentimes I'll follow up the putty with some E6000 just on top of the putty to help keep it in place forever. So as you can see, I've got the putty affixed in the 4 corners and a few other places. It's going to do a great job at holding this visor still while we add the green window tint to this visor. It's going to give it a great look. Now in this window tint, the sticky side is the green side, so we're going to have to lay the green down on the visor on the inside. So all we needed to do was cut out a rectangle that fit the visor completely, peel off the protective layer on top so that it could become sticky, and then lay it on the inside of the visor. Now you see me here kind of pressing it down. I actually wouldn't recommend you do that. I figured that out after I stopped recording, but sticking it down, like pressing hard on the tint, kind of leads to bubbles and little bumps and raised areas that kind of makes the visor look not as uniform and clean. What I'd recommend you do instead is just gently lay the tint on the visor, and if you do it gently, it should not lead to any of those bubbles or bumps or ugly spots on the visor, and it'll still give you a great look. Alright, one more step to go. We're almost done, guys. Last thing we need to do is attach the antenna and the little mouth details. We're going to do that with some E6000. Now for the antenna, you don't want to apply any E6000 to the antenna stem itself because it needs to be able to move freely, and it can't do that if it's glued down in place. So only apply glue to the base of the helmet, the place where the ear cap meets the main body of the helmet. We don't want any glue on that rangefinder antenna. What I'm going to do is use some just blue masking tape to hold everything in place while the glue cures, because the glue takes around 24 hours to fully cure, and we don't want things moving around in the meantime. I'll do the same thing for the mouth details, just a little dab of E6000, put them in place, and then put some tape over it to make sure that they don't fall out overnight. Come back tomorrow, take the tape off, and you should have yourself a finished Imperial Crosshair helmet. So there you go, guys. That is how I made my own Imperial Crosshair helmet and how you can do the same. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, or this made you feel confident enough to take on this sort of project, because I believe you definitely can. I'll see all you guys in the next video.